How disobedience led to the killing of the promising crown prince in the old kingdom of Aramoco. People still speak about Crown Prince Edward with pain in their voices, because he was not a wicked prince, he was not a lazy prince, and he was not a prince who hated his people, but he was a young man whose bright future ended because he refused to obey one clear warning at the moment it mattered most. The elders said he was born on a rainy night, the kind of night farmers loved, because rain meant food, life, and hope. And when the royal midwife carried him out to King Roland, the king held the child close to his chest and said the gods had given the kingdom a son who would one day carry the crown with wisdom. From the day Edward began to walk, the palace knew he was different because he was curious, brave, and quick to learn, and by the time he was 12, he could ride a horse better than many grown warriors, read old treaties better than many scribes, and speak to common people with a kindness that made them forget he was royal. The people loved him because he did not act as if the palace walls made him better than them, and whenever he followed his father to the marketplace, he greeted farmers, bowed to old women, asked fishermen about the river, and listened when children ran beside him shouting his name. King Roland saw all these things, and pride lived in his heart, but fear lived there too, because a promising child can become a blessing to a kingdom, and the same child can become a target for every enemy hiding beyond the border. The kingdom of Aramoco had known peace for almost 18 years, but that peace was thin, like a clay pot with a small crack, because beyond the northern hills lived Lord Marcus, a former royal commander who had betrayed the throne many years before. Marcus had once served King Roland, but his hunger for power turned him into an enemy, and after he was banished, he gathered angry soldiers, thieves, and rejected chiefs around him, and he promised them that one day he would return to Aramoco and take the crown by blood. King Roland knew Marcus well, and because of that, he raised Prince Edward with discipline, patience, and caution, because he understood that a prince does not belong only to himself, and every step he takes can save a kingdom or endanger it. Edward listened to his father in many things, but he struggled with one weakness, and that weakness was pride dressed as courage, because he hated being protected, he hated being told to wait, and he hated hearing people say he was still too young to understand the weight of the throne. When the prince turned 21, the palace held a great ceremony in his honor, and people came from every corner of the kingdom to celebrate the man who would one day become their king. Drummers played from morning till night, dancers filled the palace courtyard, women sang his praise, hunters fired arrows into the air, and old chiefs blessed him with words that made him feel as if destiny had already placed the crown on his head. That evening, as the sun fell behind the palace roof, King Roland called Edward into the private council room, where only kings, heirs, and trusted elders were allowed to sit. The room was quiet, and the walls carried the carved names of kings who had ruled before them, so Edward stood taller than normal, because he felt the eyes of dead rulers watching him. King Roland sat on the carved wooden chair at the center of the room, and beside him stood General Harris, the commander of the royal guard, and Elder Gregory, the old advisor whose words carried more weight than gold. The king looked at his son for a long time before speaking, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and serious. He told Edward that the spies at the northern border had brought disturbing news, because Lord Marcus had started moving men through the forest paths again, and strange fires had been seen near the abandoned watchtowers. Edward's eyes hardened at once, because the name of Marcus had always filled him with anger, and he had grown up hearing how that man betrayed the kingdom and caused the deaths of loyal soldiers. The prince stepped forward and said his father should send him to the border with 50 warriors, because he would bring Marcus back in chains and prove to the whole kingdom that their future king was not a child hiding behind palace curtains. King Roland raised his hand and told him no. The word was simple, but it struck Edward like a slap, because he had expected his father to be proud of his courage, not to silence him in front of the general and the advisor. The king told him that courage without obedience becomes danger, and a prince who runs ahead of wisdom may lead his people into mourning. Edward clenched his jaw, but the king continued. He told him that for the next 7 days, he must not leave the palace grounds without direct permission, He must not speak to any messenger from the northern border, and he must not ride toward the old forest road, no matter what news he heard. The prince stared at his father with disbelief, because to him, the command sounded like distrust. He asked the king if he was being punished for loving the kingdom, and King Roland answered that he was being protected because the kingdom needed him alive more than it needed him angry. Those words should have settled inside Edward's heart, but pride was already standing at the door of his mind. Elder Gregory moved closer and told him that many princes had died not because they lacked strength, but because they mistook warning for insult. Edward bowed because palace custom demanded it, but his heart did not bow. When he left the council room, his face was calm, but inside him resentment burned. That night, his closest friend Benjamin found him in the training yard striking a wooden post with his sword until his arm shook. Benjamin had grown up with him in the palace, and he spoke with honesty. He told Edward that obedience was not weakness, and that a son who listens today may rule tomorrow. Edward laughed without joy and said obedience was the favorite word of men who feared action. Benjamin begged him to be careful, but Edward turned away and said he would not be a prince who needed permission to act. The next morning, a thin young messenger arrived at the western gate carrying a sealed letter claiming he came from a farming village near the northern hills. Instead of going through the royal council, the letter was quietly sent to Edward. The message claimed that Lord Marcus had captured villagers and begged the prince to come through the forest road to rescue them. The letter spoke in emotional language designed to break a young heart. Edward did not question why it bypassed the king. He did not question why the route matched the forbidden road. He only saw a chance to prove himself. Benjamin read the letter and warned him that it was a trap, but Edward refused to listen. That night, Edward left the palace with 12 guards. Benjamin stood at the gate and begged him again, but Edward rode out into the darkness. The forest became silent as they moved deeper, and soon arrows came from both sides. It was a trap. Lord Marcus stepped out and revealed the truth. There were no villagers. There was only betrayal shaped by Edward's disobedience. The guards fell one by one. Edward fought bravely, but numbers swallowed courage. He finally understood that every warning he ignored was a step toward this moment. Marcus ordered him taken alive, but chaos followed. In the struggle, Edward fell. His last thought was not anger, but regret. At dawn, Benjamin brought the news to King Roland. The king rode to the forest with General Harris. When he saw his son's body, he said nothing at first. He simply knelt and held Edward as if silence could reverse time. Queen Margaret collapsed when she saw the procession return to the palace. The kingdom mourned for days. No celebration followed. No music played. Only grief remained. On the 7th day, King Roland spoke to the people. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of obedience and wisdom. He said his son was brave, but bravery without discipline destroys more than it saves. Years later, Princess Eleanor, Edward's younger sister, became heir. She visited her brother's grave and promised to listen before acting. The kingdom remembered Edward not only as a prince with promise, but as a warning that pride can destroy what destiny tries to protect. That is how disobedience led to the killing of the promising crown prince, not because he lacked greatness, but because he chose pride over warning and silence over wisdom.